Romania. Oh, yeah, you've been there. But I don't think you've ever been in the forest. No. Transylvania is in fact, Silva means forest. So Transylvania is the country beyond the forest. You've probably heard about Dracula and other fictionary stories which have nothing to do with reality. So yes, I was born in the city where the father of Dracula lived. The name of the father was Vlad Dracul. Dracul means Satan. So, yeah, it's a traditional name, popular name in Romania. And the son of this guy is the one who you know him by the name Dracula. The story is pure fiction, has nothing to do with reality. In fact, he was a very, very good leader when he lived in Transylvania. Anyway, that place, that part of the country of Romania, is one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. It's full of forests, very dense and big forests. So when I was a student, one day I decided to take a few friends, young people like me, to have a trip. And we went on a different route that normally we would. We ended up 5-6 hours later realizing that we don't know where we are. We looked around us, trees everywhere. There's no path here, no sign. Nobody amongst us knew exactly where we were. So we said, well, let's pick up a direction and go there. We have to get somewhere. And that's what we did. We ended up in a village 7 hours later, in the exactly opposite direction. It was nice, but in the same time, when we realized we were lost, it was a bit scary. You're not afraid in Romania that people will do anything bad to you, especially in the forest, in the villages, but being lost, not knowing exactly where you are, not knowing exactly where you're going, it was a bit scary. I don't know how you felt when you were lost. But being lost is not something comfortable. It makes you think of and invent things in your mind and see things that are not necessarily real. The story this morning is about somebody who was lost. Maybe you were told or not. Right, they asked me about the topic, and I told them it's the parable about the prodigal son. Because I wasn't sure if I can tell them that I'm going to preach about the prodigal Jesus. I thought if I don't have the time to explain them, why am I saying that? And they only get to see the title, they'll say, no, this is crazy. But yes, the title of the sermon is The Prodigal Jesus. And the story is the story about prodigal son, but I'm telling you that's the wrong title of it. You've heard many sermons on the parable, I'm sure. But I want to invite you to look to this with different eyes today. If you have your Bibles and you can open, it's Luke chapter 15, and we will start reading from verse 11. I'm using New Revised Standard Version, so if it seems strange to you, that's because I'm using probably a different version than you are using one. So Luke chapter 15, verse 11. Are we there? Right. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends.' For a young person, if he's honest enough and has enough courage to go to his parents, life happens more outside the house than inside. That's reality. I'm still young, and I have a young son, and very often I disagree with him because it seems that it's easy to forget. But he reminds me all the time that I need to be patient, because being young, it means to want to learn, to be curious about everything that's outside. You want to protect, but you have to learn as a parent. You can never protect your kids all the time. That's not possible, no matter how much you want to do that. I look at this father in the parable and I'm thinking, why didn't he try a bit harder to convince his son to stay home? The story tells us that the younger son went to his father and told him, "Father, give me my share because I want to go out with my friends." And the father, just like that, he said, "Okay, if that's what you want, this is yours, this is your brother's. Do what you want with this." If you have a son who comes to you and asks you for, a different lifestyle, what would you do? Let's say, for the argument's sake, that your son comes to you, or your daughter comes to you, and they're saying, "Father, I know it's Sabbath, I know you're preaching today, I know it's our church day, but today my colleagues, they have a party, and the party starts at 12 midday, and their plan is to finish by tomorrow morning. It's a very long party. We want to have a lot of fun. So I want to go." What do you say to him? "I'm sorry, son. You live in my house. I'm putting food on the table. I'm going to tell you what to do. You're not going anywhere." The only problem is the father in the parable says, fine, son, if that's what you want to do, you know, in my house you have always been free. If you want to stay, you stay. If you want to leave, you leave. Have you ever been in love? All the men who are married, you're supposed to raise your hands, otherwise when you go back home. Now, if you have ever been in love, that you know, you can't force somebody to love you. You can't force somebody to stay with you. You have to give them all the freedom to stay or leave whenever they want. When Adam sinned, God could have stopped him very easily, but he gave Adam the freedom to make his choice, even if he knew that Adam would make a mistake, even if he knew that the price was extremely high, even if he knew that in the end he is going to be the one who's going to pay the price. So he gave him freedom because he loved him. If your son or daughter comes to you and they say, Father, I want to try something different. I'm sorry to say that, but what I learned in the church and what I experience in the church is not enough for me. I'm not happy. I'm not happy just to go there and sing songs and pray and listen to sermons, sometimes boring sermons. I look at my kids, every time I have to stand here and preach, I have to tell them half an hour maximum and I finish. Yes. We have to be honest enough to recognize when our children, when our people, they want something else. One of the greatest thinkers ever, his name is Friedrich Nietzsche. You may not have read anything by him. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever read something from Nietzsche? Very few people. Because the way his name was advertised, people don't make him very interesting. But this guy, his father was a Lutheran priest. His grandfather for his father's side was a Lutheran priest as well. His grandfather from his mother's side was a Lutheran priest as well. So 3. He started studying theology to become a priest. And he says he became one of the greatest atheists ever. The world as you see it today is influenced in a big, big way by his thought, even though people have no clue about what he wrote and what he said. His ideas today are the one that shape people's minds. You have never heard of him, but he's the one who shapes modernity and postmodernism. And he said, what I have against Christianity, and basically against any religion, is this. People are not honest enough to start verifying themselves. I told you I was an atheist. When I became Christian, the reason why I became Christian was because my mother, who was an atheist, she said, listen, you have to search for yourself. You don't just accept my ideas for you. You may see things in a different way. So I started studying in a critical manner both Christianity, religion, and atheism. Many years later, like 5 or 6 years later, I became an Adventist. Amen. It took me 2 years of studying the Bible and the Adventist doctrine to finally accept intellectually that what I hear here is, the truth, that I'm happy to accept. But my mistake was that as soon as I did that, I thought that's enough. From now on, I don't have to keep searching and keep having the same type of mentality, and I was wrong. The only reason why we are here today is because our pioneers, they were always searching. They always kept their mind open. They always believed that God has something new for them. If you stop searching, if you feel satisfied, there's no way you can grow. Our pioneers, they were all open-minded, and I wish to see this in my churches today. Don't be afraid to search. Don't be afraid to question yourself. Don't be afraid to ask yourself, am I right if this is what I believe or not? I was talking to one of my friends once, and he said to me, I don't believe in God. I don't know how you can believe in God. And I said, well, you have to be a bit more specific for me. What do you mean? I said, maybe I don't believe in the same God that you don't believe in. All you have to do is explain me what God is this that you don't believe. I believe probably in a different type of God. So let's talk about it. If you tell him from the beginning, oh, you're wrong, I tell you why you should believe in God, maybe you're wrong, because maybe you don't believe in the God that he doesn't believe. This son wanted to experience. He wanted something new. But the story isn't about him. We are all human beings. We all want to learn new things. We are all curious. We are scared sometimes to try something because some people may see us, or maybe if we try something that's wrong, we might have to suffer different consequences. But this son said, you know what? I don't care what's going to happen with me. I want to try something new. And the father thought, it's all right, son. I've been like you. I want to try new things. This is your share. Do whatever you please to it. So he left. He left home so quickly. Maybe it's a bit surprising. If he was happy in that home, why would he leave that house so quickly? The Bible tells us the son, a few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and he traveled to a distant country. So first of all, very few days. He didn't have time to admire his new property. Then he left in a very far, distant country. Why? Let me ask you something. You have quite a few students here. How many of you are local students, in the sense that your parents live here? Can you raise your hands, please? And how many of you are from quite far and distant cities from England? Come on, don't be shy. Right. Let me put it this way. I speak to, I won't give names because you know them anyway, so I won't do this mistake. I spoke to some of the students that I know. And when I ask them, where do you want to go and study? They'll say, it doesn't matter where, as long as it's far from home. Why? Why? You know the answer. I don't have to say it myself, but you know it. So there's no surprise that this guy, a young guy, he wanted to go somewhere far. So his father cannot go and follow him, or news about him don't get back home very quickly, or I don't know. He wanted to cut all his connections with home. He wanted to be totally free. And then he did something natural. I believe that if anyone would have asked his father, what do you think is going to happen with your son? How can you give him half of your wealth when you know what's going to happen with him? You know he's going to lose everything very soon. How can you be so reckless and give him also all your money or whatever? And the father knew that. The father was a wise father, so he knew exactly what's going to happen with his son. Despite of that, he still gave his son what he asked for. So he squandered his property. I like this translation because it says dissolute living. How do you understand these words? What does it mean, dissolute? What is dissolution? Can you define the term?
Thinking without thought of the future.
Just the present. That's all I have, is here. But then, no matter how much you think in the present, no matter how much you are anchored in the present, the future will always get to you. You don't have the future, but the future will always get to you. Always. That's something that you cannot avoid. So live in the future, in the present, but be always aware of the future. Dissolute living means something like, have you ever put a collar in the water? And then the collar gets the whole water? There's no water then, although it's there, but it's all color now. Well, his life was something like, it was spread all over the place. He's lost control over it. It's like when you are in the forest, you look around and nothing makes sense to you because you're lost. You look in your right, nothing tells you anything. You don't recognize anything there. You look in your left, nothing that you know. No matter which way you want to go, it's the same for you because you're completely lost. That is dissolute living. But that's when you're lost, not because you don't know the surroundings. It's because you're lost because you're lost in yourself. So when the son spent everything he had, he realized that all his friends were gone. All that he had is gone. What was left? What was left? Nothing. He looked at himself and he couldn't realize who is he. There was no meaning in his life, although he was in search for the meaning. And now something happens. The story focuses on something what is more important. The Bible says, he came to himself. What does that mean? He came to himself. He didn't go to church. He didn't find a priest. He didn't find a rabbi. He didn't find money. He didn't find a job. He didn't get some qualification at universities. He was looking for something, but that something was not given by money, achievements, relationships with friends. What he was looking for was much closer to him than he ever knew. He came to himself. And he says, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? What is he doing? He puts his life in the right perspective. He was at home first, and he wanted to go out. And he was totally fine about that, to experience something new. But that's only because he was never aware of what he had at home. He says, my father's hired hands have bread enough. They have a nice life. In his mind, who are these people in his father's house? Those in his home. Who are they? Sorry? servants. What kind of servants? Hired servants. Now jump a little bit forward and see what's the name that the elder son is using for the people in his father's house. The same people. So the younger one calls them hired servants. What does that mean? If you're hired, you paid. You get something in return. But if you're a slave, then what? You get nothing. Because you don't owe anything. Your life belongs to somebody else. The younger son, far away now, he looks at his father's house and he thinks, people there, they have good jobs. They are paid in a right way, in an honest way by my father. Why can't I have that? Later on, we find out that the elder son, he says, Father, I was like a slave all the time. Was he ever paid? We'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, he says, fathers hired servants. And then he decides, I'm going to go home and I'll tell my father, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. Now tell me something. What does he wish now? He doesn't want to be a slave. He says, I'm going to work and I want to be paid. Am I right? Hire me. Basically, that's his wish. Father, hire me. I'm going to do my job and you're going to pay me and I'm not going to starve. I'm not going to die. But then he's not very honest. He says, and people like when they read this, I have sinned against you, against heaven and before you, so I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But tell me, when he talks to his father, how does he address him? What is this? If you're not worthy to be called his son, you don't call him father. Because when you tell somebody father, that means you're his son. So why is he calling his father father if he says, I'm not worthy to be your son? And not only that he planned that, when he goes home, he says, he met his father, and he said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Does he mean it? He was lost. He really, really was lost. But I told you from the beginning, the story is not about the son, although I had spoken so far about the son, because this is the background. Now the story is about the father. A few things. Can you tell me, in ancient times, how were people dressed? For example, men. What was the normal dress code for a man, an old man? A tie and a jacket and trousers, No, they were wearing robes, like a skirt, right? What is the problem with this father? We read here, while the son was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion, and he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. These things make no sense. Maybe they make sense to us in our westernized world. But in those days, what the father did was totally unnatural and against all the rules of the society. First of all, if you are an old man, you don't run. Not because you're old and you cannot run, just because it's a sign of disrespect to run. Secondly, because if you run and you're having a skirt, imagine that. An old man, respectful person, runs with his skirt in his hands, showing his shameful parts. Yes, because it was a shame to show your bottom of the legs. It was a shame. Now, there's also something illegal that he does. When one of your sons disobey you and they bring an offense on the parents, what is the law saying? Sorry? You have to pay a price. And the one who needs to be the first one punishing the person who deserves punishment is the father. What is the father doing here? He says, I love him. Bible calls this compassion. Nietzsche, the guy I told you about, when he wrote many books against Christianity. One of his books is called Antichrist. More than half of that book, which is a very short, thin book, you can read it in 2 hours. It's very interesting. In more than half of that book, he writes against the idea of compassion. Because he says, people who follow Christ, they need to understand compassion is not just something like you look at this person suffering and you say, oh, poor of him. I have compassion of him. And then you move on. That's how compassion looks like to many people today. They have a feeling in their heart and they feel sorry for that person. Maybe they even cry or they pray and that's it, they move on. Compassion, he says, only Christ had compassion. Because when you are compassionate, you're moved. And compassion moves you to action. So what is the father doing? He runs, he put his arms around him, and third one, he kissed him. What does the kiss mean? Do you know when Adam and Eve was created? They were both created. What was the method that God used to create them? Right. Out of everything created, how many things were created by touch? Only the man and his wife. Everything else, God was, the word came out of his mouth and it came to be. When it was about human beings, he touched them. And when he put life in Adam, he kissed him. The word in Hebrew, when the Bible says, he breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, it's the same word as kissing him. There are a few resurrections in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's one. I will let it with you to remember who did it and to whom, but I'll tell you what happened. A child was dead, and the prophet of the Lord entered the room. He cleared up the room and asked everybody else to go out. And the way he resurrected the child is very interesting. He put his body on the child's body, his hand on the child's hand, his head on the child's head, his foot on the child's foot, his mouth on the child's mouth, and so forth. That's very interesting. There's a practice, a ritual in India, when in a sect the father is obviously the priest of the family, and he will lead everything. And if at some point the father becomes unable to fulfill his duties as a priest, physically speaking, because he's too old and he's not capable anymore to do what he was supposed to do, then his elder son is supposed to take his place. But that's normal to happen only when the father dies. Or because the father is still alive, but he physically is not able to do it, they invented a process in which they transfer the responsibility from the father to the son. And it's exactly the same type of method. The father puts his body on his son's body, and he says, my hand into your hand, my head onto your head, my, leg onto your hand. And then the father is called a dead alive. When the father in this story comes to meet his son, he's not only compassionate from distance, looking to his son and thinking, you know what, I'm going to give him a lesson now. I look at him and I can see his clothes are the way they should be. He's poor, he's probably hungry. He left home being well and sound, and now he's coming back. He's thin like a... Let him come back home. And when he enters the gate, I have a few words for him to remember me. No. That's not compassion. That's not wisdom. The father looks at him, and the way it's expressed here is like the father was waiting for him. We don't know for how long. And he's not surprised to see his son coming. And when he sees him from a distance, he's not blind. He can still see in the distance. My grandfather, when he didn't want to hear something, he would say, can you say me again? He was 86, 87. And we were trying to explain him some things, and he didn't want to understand. So he was saying, I can't hear you, I can't understand, I can't see very well. And then when I was going out and playing with my friends outside and was doing something wrong, he was shouting at me, Dan, come home. Going home and said, you know, what you did is not right. I said, how can you tell me what I did, because you don't see very well? Oh, I see enough in the distance. So this father had a good sight. He looked after his son. He saw his son coming. And his compassion, his real compassion, moved him. He couldn't just stay there. He had to move. He had to run. He had to hug him. He had to kiss him. Even though it was against all the laws of the community. Even though it was against all the common sense that people taught him. So this type of Christianity is meaningless in a world like ours. When Jesus asked the young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor, where was the meaning in that? Just come and follow me. Well, who are you? He had no school, no house of his, no talk about his family, problems there. Why would he follow him? This father knew that what he does is against all the norms of the society, but he also knew that this is exactly what a child of God would do if his son is coming back home. If your son is coming back home after he dishonored you, how would you treat him? What kind of father is this father? Is he a prodigal? He wasted his fortune with his son because he just gave it to him like it didn't even matter. The son said, split your fortune and give my share. He just did it. He worked all his life for what he had. And he gave it away in a split second. Was he reckless? According to our society rules, yes, he was. He was a prodigal, not the son. The prodigal son of the prodigal father. Think about this. Jesus left his home. Am I right? He came in a foreign country. He spent all he had, his life. In the end, he returned home. And in heaven, he will be the only one for the whole eternity who is not perfect. Your body and my body will have no imperfection. His body will always wear the signs of imperfection. Amen. Because he is the prodigal son of a prodigal father. Now, you see, there's always a story about two brothers. The father is the same. This guy here is a very calculated person. He may have been an accountant or a manager or I don't know, but somebody who has a very calculated mind. He needs to calculate his steps because if he knows if you make a mistake, you may lose everything. And in the end he says, well, look at my brother. He was reckless. He was extravagant. He was unwise. I don't want to use a stronger word. He has lost everything because of that. I have to be different. I have to be exactly the opposite. I have rules in my life. I have to follow rules. Because if you follow rules, if you're disciplined, then what? Everything goes well. Then you have meaning. Because the law brings you meaning. What is the law? It tells you if this happens, these are the consequences. In maths, 2 plus 2 is always 4. In our maths. For God, 1 plus 1 is sometimes 2, but most of the time is 1. Because he is the author of a superior maths. And this son is not aware of that. He has still a lot to learn. But he is fixed in his discipline, which is not a bad thing. I'm not against discipline. But in this case, he had to learn a very difficult lesson. He was at home. He followed all the rules of the house. He says, for all these years, I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your commands. Never. That's something. How do you know that? Not even once. Never. He's been the best child possible. Perfect child. He does everything you say. I wasn't like that. So where's the problem then? Do you recognize yourself in this picture? Let me tell you something. If Jesus decided to come this morning to church to preach, would you allow him to do it? If you knew that he's Jesus. But when Jesus comes to you, he very often looks like somebody else. And I'm pretty much sure that if he would come here as a man, very few of us would like him. Because we have our program, and we cannot disturb the program. I have a friend who told me, listen, I want to go to church, but sometimes I just want to go there, and I don't want to do anything. I just want to talk to people. I don't want Sabbath school, divine service, song service and all that. I just want to go to church. Well, I don't think that's possible. Because we have our own rules. We have to follow them. Can you tell me what was the greatest revival that ever happened in Wales, and when did that happen? When?
The Welsh Valleys Revival, 1920.
1920s. Do you know who is the main character of the story? A young man. And do you know how everything started? And how things happened on those days? I don't think you can give me an example of after that revival or before, when all the stadiums here were empty because people decided to go to church. Only then that happened. And I tell you what, they've never had an organized program. They decided they go to church because it was the only thing they could do. They went there, they started singing, they sat down, and at some point, one of them stood up, started preaching. The guy who was the main character, the name will come to mind in a moment. But that guy was always expected to preach. Most of the time, he was there, he was praying. He preached many times, but most of the times he was just sitting saying, no, God has nothing to say through me today. I can't remember the name. If you go on Google, help me. But those years, or 2 years I think, of revival in England, in Wales, were absolutely amazing. There were football games where nobody was on the stadium because everybody was in the church.
David Matthews.
No. There's one name, but that's not the main one. I'll remember and I'll post it on your Facebook page.
Stephen Roberts?
Yes. Evan Roberts. That's the one. But this guy, he could never have a revival because he was stuck in his rules. Not against the rules. I'm not against the rules. But those rules were meant to bring him closer to his father. He became a prodigal in his own house. And to be honest, this is the only prodigal in the story, in the real sense. Because he thought he knows better than his father on how to treat his children. He thought he knows better than his father on how to forgive somebody. And he had absolutely no idea about that. This story is about grace. I have a friend, he's a pastor. He was a very, very strict person when he was a pastor in Romania. When I met him, boy, he was following all the written and unwritten rules. You didn't want to have problems with him. He was very, very strict. And he was the same with his own person. He had a time to wake up, to do his prayers, to do his Bible studies. People were saying that he would never answer the phone before 10 o'clock because between 4 and 10 o'clock, that's his study time. and you can't bother him then. I don't know if that's true or not. He knows the Bible very well. But then something happened and he had to leave the country. He went to the United States. He's a pastor there. And he became a different person. And I asked him not long time ago, I said, what made you change? And he said, I understood the nature of grace better. He says to me, the story of the prodigal son is my story. I'm thinking, he is the prodigal son? Come on. He said, yes. Look at the bigger brother. Look at the elder brother. I am that guy. And that's the prodigal son. Because the younger one, he left. He squandered his money. But then he came back because he realized a little bit about what father he has at home. And he went back home. And what is interesting, the younger son starts with, Father, I'm not worthy, but then he thinks about the place where he goes as home. What's the name of the place for the elder son? What is that? It's not home. It's just house. There's a difference between house and home. We all may have a house to live in, but we may never feel at home. You may have many great things in life, but you're still not at home. The younger son knew that when he goes back home. What makes a house home? Family. Family. He knew he goes home because he knew he goes back to his father. The elder son was only in a house because he never perceived his father as a father, because he never considered him a son of his father. And look at what he says. I have been working like a slave for you, not even a hired servant, just a slave. I have never disobeyed your commands. You don't have to obey or disobey your father. You have to love your father. And whatever you do it to your father. And he will treat you like a son. And you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Tell me something. When he goes back home, then there's a party there, a celebration. Who's celebrating with whom? The father with the son, the family. If his father would tell him, son, organize the party now. Bring the young goat or whatever you want. Use whatever you want to throw out the party. What would the elder son do? Invite who? His friends. His father was not one of them. You see, there are just details here, but these details make the story different. When you look at God, when you pray to God, when you preach here about Him, how do you perceive Him? Like a far distant, cold, almighty God, who He is, right? But He is also the God who gave everything He had for you and me to be able to go back home. Because He doesn't want a party with His friends. He wants a party with His family. And if you don't know, or how you have forgotten, we are His family. He put His image on us. By the way, and I'm closing with this. I never preach such a long sermon. In Middlesbrough, we start sermon like 20 past 12. We never start at 12 o'clock. Anyway, if you explain me why do we have the second command? Do you know what the second command is? Against images and idols. So God doesn't want us to create an image of Him to worship. Why? Because He had already done that. We are His image. We don't have to create another image of God to worship. He doesn't want us to worship His image. He wants us to love His image. Because we are His family. You look at me and you should see your brother and you should see a reason why God loves you and why you could love God. And I look at you and I can see how amazing our God is because He's our Father. And we are all brothers and sisters. Prodigals or not. Because He is the prodigal God, the prodigal Father. He paid everything that was needed to be paid for us to be brought back home. It would be a shame for any human being to lose because the price was already paid and the price was high. May God bless us all while He hugs us and kisses us with His love. Amen.